token whimsical intro. Welcome back to the Hate Meditations podcast. Sorry for the hiatus. The last few weeks have been subpar, to say the least. But we're back, and I brought gallons of your piss, and I intend to boil it. I've got beer, I've got the void, and I am joined by the one and only Jason, a.k.a. Lone Goat, Scholar, Musician, Agent Provocateur, Lover. How you doing, Jason?
Dude, I am doing fucking fantastic. I have been writing some black metal and I've been working on that shit. Got a fucking drummer in France he likes beating up a lot of people, who's currently building a jiu-jitsu dojo. And I got also the producer in France that I'm working with. He plays bass really fucking phenomenally. And yeah, they're both joining my black metal project. Really great individuals, as well as got a phenomenal fucking vocalist who I'm working with, and I'm getting all of his takes. I'm writing lyrics and all kinds of stuff. And yesterday, we had strife between the non-bacon eaters. There was Boom Boom Tel Aviv and Boom Boom Tehran. Wow. And it was fucking crazy, is that my neighborhood celebrates the 4th of July early, so right after the news broke, I started hearing all the fucking fireworks going off. I'm like, are we being bombed? Like, I was looking at my dogs, because my dogs were going crazy, and, right after the news broke, it was just boom, 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 boom. I'm like, damn, that's fucking fast. But, yeah, really excited, and hail fucking Satan.
So, when you're in a bar or a pub, as we say in the UK, and you're kind of listening to someone boring and you're nodding along and you sort of think, I already know what this guy's going to say. Jason's the exact opposite of that. I never know what the fuck he's going to say, and that's why we keep him around. And I've also got the ladies' favourite, the people's champion, diplomat extraordinaire, Joseph April. How you doing, my man?
Hey, Shelley. Hey, Jason. Doing well. Yeah, and as Jason mentioned, the news certainly has been in sights recently, I think for probably a lot of people. But otherwise, on a personal level, yeah, just doing fine, coasting the summer. It is a hot fucking day out, and hopefully it won't continue to be this hot.
What's hot mean to you in terms of...
Well, here we get in the Fahrenheit versus Celsius thing, don't we?
You can say Fahrenheit. I'll just do a conversion quickly.
It's like mid-90s, getting close to hundreds.
Dude, I live in fucking Texas. Like, you want to talk about hot? You come down here.
Oh, I know. And remember, I lived in L.A. and not near the ocean, L.A., so it got hot.
So just to put that into context, yesterday was an extremely hot day here in Leeds, but it got to about 85 Fahrenheit. That's what we class as hot in the north of England. Anyway, we're ignoring the
10 here in Texas, quite, every summer 110.
Yeah, but you've been to Yorkshire, Jason. You know how often we have rain and grey sky. So, yeah, we're ignoring the imminent apocalypse and World War III right now, as our guests have alluded to. And I figured it's been a little while for us, so just to get us back on the road, I know it's very Route 1, but I just needed to stop myself from contemplating the yawning chasm at the heart of it all. So I fancied a casual chat about some classic death metal. So we're going back to basics and doing a good old-fashioned tier list. As you can see, we've got some albums lined up. They are all from 1990, and they all fit into the genre of death metal. And in the...
Debatable, very debatable. We'll get into that.
Oh, we will get into that. I'm sure we will. In fact, we might even get into that with this very first album. I was just about to say I've ordered them in the grand tradition of the alphabet, which means we are starting with a band called Atheist. With their debut album, Piece of Time, which I believe was actually, most of this was recorded in 1989, if memory serves, and a lot of these tracks were actually written much, much earlier when Atheist were called Ravage, an acronym whose exact words I can't actually remember off the top of my head, Raging Atheist something or other. Someone's already screaming at me, but like I said, I do intend to boil your piss. So this, in many ways, probably one of the like archetypical or very first proto-progressive death metal albums. And I did allude to this when Joseph, Tyler, and I did a focus episode on Floridian death metal, in that scene in particular was both one of the earliest in terms of, fashioning the form that we know and love as death metal, but also the earliest to fashion what became known as progressive death metal. And it was almost right out of the gate, because Atheist, long before Death, quite a few years before Pestilence, and quite a few others, were already exploring the crossover of like the technicalities and the complexity that death metal was reaching, and infusing it with things like jazz and samba and progressive rock into what was still ostensibly almost a thrash band in a lot of ways. Some of the older tracks on this album, think of things like On the Sleigh, function very much like technical thrash in the spirit of something like Watchtower, Coroner, that kind of thing. So in that regard, it's kind of it's an interesting time capsule in a lot of ways, because it embodies the primitivism of early death metal, the kind of the raw enthusiasm that you needed just to get the thing over the line. It's quite sloppy. The production, despite it being a Scott Burns job, it was quite early on in Scott Burns's kind of acquaintance with producing death metal in a sort of professional setting. It is quite sort of rough around the edges, especially if you're comparing it to, the modern idea of technical or progressive metal, which is very slick, very polished, very kind of well orchestrated. This is still a very much an 80s sort of extreme metal album, but also there is the clear kind of sophistication to it. These like what's the word? These just off-kilter moments, these odd choices, the rampant kind of time signature changes, manipulation of key, the very, very driving bass lines. It's a very, very kind of, there's a lot going on, both sort of at the substantive level, just the raw experience of listening to it, but also kind of the cultural crossroads that you kind of find on this album as an early iteration of progressive death metal, but still kind of embodying that kind of raw primitivism. I already know partially, well, I know how this vote is going to go for Jason, but for me, this is kind of, I do tend to favor the follow-up, Unquestionable Presence, because I think that sort of sits in probably always around my top 5 albums of all time. But this one I also am going to have to rank as an S, because it is just one of the most unique death metal albums going. So I'm just going to pop it up there for now, and then I'll let Jason rank it all the way back down.
I'm not going to be that cruel, Shelly. Granted, you do know that I'm not really a fan of progressive death metal in general. I like the Blood and Guts. I like, of course, Morbid Angel, which unfortunately is not on this list today, is my favorite band ever, other than Celtic Frost and, all that. But I was just going to be nice, because the guy who got me into death metal, Alan Moses, who very influential figure for me, wrote Glorious Times when I was 12. He actually recommended Atheist to me, and he recommended Piece of Time and Unquestionable Presence. And I remember that because I memorized the list, a 2-page list of metal bands for me to check out. That way, whenever I was out, like in a shopping mall or whatnot, I would, slowly get things. But Atheist was never a band to really click with me. I want to give it an A tier, just because I do respect some of the riffs that are in it. Even though it's not really what I'm drawn to, it's still very respectable. It's still well put together. It does, have the jazz, which I feel that Demolik did a better job at assimilating jazz in a death metal than Atheist, but that's a story for another day. But for 1990, yeah, this was a very forward-looking album, and, I'd be a shithead if I did not rate it, highly. So I'll give it an A. Joseph, your thoughts?
Yeah, this was pretty early in the discovering death metal. I was introduced to this album. I enjoyed it a lot, but I do think over the years I think my enthusiasm for this and the band in general waned a little bit. Not too dissimilar from Jason's statement in terms of preferring more the bloody, gory part of death metal. I mean, I still actually probably enjoy more progressive-leaning stuff, but less than I used to.
Because you like blood incantation, which is quote-unquote progressive death metal.
Well, yeah, I mean less. I mean less than I used to, and certainly less than I know some people do. Like, I mean, again, Autopsy is maybe one of my favorite death metal bands. So, and again, unfortunately, not included here since their albums bookend 1990. But no, I think Atheist is certainly in a historical sense is a very important band. You can't talk about the progressive turn in death metal without talking about them. Also, just that they were an important part of the Florida scene. Although I remember from enough interviews and articles about them how they were not well received often in the scene at the time, which kind of explains why they kind of disappeared for a while, making sense. Bands usually can only take so much negative beatings until they go, you know what, fuck it, we're out of here. But in terms of a ranking, I definitely think A is appropriate. Like, I would even maybe consider giving it B just to make sure it ends up in the A section. I don't think it deserves S in that if I'm going to give any Atheist album an S ranking, it would be Unquestionable Presence, which I do think is the best work they ever did. So in my head, it's just, I would never put Piece of Time above Unquestionable Presence. And I just want to also note Shelley. I think it was a good note pointing out the Watchtower influence on them. I think that's definitely noticeable, that progressive thrash influence, and especially given that some of the songs are much older when death metal was in its very primitive stages. It's easy to imagine a band like Watchtower probably being influenced along with like the more extreme side of thrash and like probably Dark Angel. Which just to say to everyone, beware if you check out Watchtower, because I love some progressive thrash, but I've never been able to get in that band because of the vocals, which
if they're too much for Joseph, they're probably too much for you.
That's always the thing.
Yeah, it's sort of clean metal crooner falsetto singing over very, very complex like key changes and stuff. Like, you have to get your head in that space. I mean, it's kind of similar to King Diamond in a way, where it's just like, oh, what is he doing?
Which is funny because, like, I love King. I'm just, when it comes to voices, like, the slightest changes in tone can put something in an amazing category or put it in a god awful category for me. It's just, I'm subconsciously picky about.
Yeah, and I mean,
tone.
I guess not to spend too long on this album, but talking about vocals, like they
true,
they sit at sort of that midpoint of sort of thrashy punk vocals with semi-clean elements, but also sort of the proto-death elements. It's not clean by any stretch of the imagination, but they do sometimes follow the melodic lines, and I think that was, for me, when I first encountered Unquestionable Presence, was one of the biggest barriers to overcome, as is often the case with any form of music. The vocals are often sort of the deal breaker. But with Atheist, it's not Cannibal Corpse, it's not Deicide. The vocals sort of sit at the cleaner end, and there is a little bit of that crossover there. But yeah, I take what you guys are saying. I think also I mentioned Pestilence, Jason mentioned Demolic, there's a few others as well, and yeah, Joseph, you're right.
Pestilence proggy though. Like
I would definitely say from Testament of the Ancients to Spheres, definitely.
Huh.
Spheres is definitely a progressive death metal album.
Yeah, I mean later on, but Consuming Impulse, that's
Consuming Impulse. No, I'm saying they, like, much like Death, they kind of started out very archetypical death metal, and then they evolved into a prog band. Whereas Atheist was sort of, obviously they had the pre-Atheist incarnation of Ravage, but by the late 80s they came straight out of the gate as a progressive death metal band. But what the point I was making was all of these bands, they didn't really last in the progressive territory for very long because, as Joseph pointed out, it wasn't well received at the time because the thing at the time was that extremity and then that power and that
I don't know how valid that statement is, though, because, like I said, Alan Moses, who was a very influential figure in Tampa, he championed Atheist, and I can only imagine that, he was in the Morbid Angel circle very heavily, that there was, a strong pro-atheist sentiment there in Tampa, maybe not in the metal media, but in the general fan base. Yeah, Atheist is one of the big bands.
Well, no, there's
well.
Sorry, Joseph, go on.
To take your point, Jason, in terms of Alan Moses or other people in the scene championing them, I think that's absolutely true. And I think probably like if you talk to members of like Morbid Angel or Death or other bands, like they'd probably talk about Atheist being a band they had some reverence for or appreciation. I think it was just the fans at the time, given what Atheists talked about their own situation, it just seemed like they weren't as well received as others. And certainly a band that I feel like later on, especially when they started performing again in the 2000s, like the audience caught up with them. And I think you could say the same thing about something like Cynic, where they talk about how no one really cared about them in terms of like fans. Of course, they were also in Miami, surrounded by no metal scene.
Yeah, I think you basically said what I was going to say, Joseph, in terms of the band themselves attest to the fact that they played lots of gigs. They were supporting some of the bigger bands in the scene, Cannibal Corpse or whoever, and they were sometimes booed off the stage just because people didn't really get what they were doing, or it wasn't the vibe at the time. But they've received that posthumous accolades, which they should have done because, as you say, the audience caught up with them. And I was sort of saying within my own taste as well, I don't like a lot of contemporary bands that try to ape the Atheist thing because I don't think they quite get what made Atheist unique in that they're one of the few proggier death metal bands that I am absolutely in awe of, whereas in general, as a whole, I'm not usually a fan of progressive death metal, although there are exceptions to that rule, and Atheist being like the original one of those exceptions. But
yeah, I mean, very respectable for them, just I have a theory about extreme metal, specifically the forms of extreme metal, where that I think, especially nowadays, I brought up Blood Incantation, which quote unquote is influenced by Time Ghoul, which is quote unquote a progressive death metal band. But the distinction there is that Time Ghoul actually wrote coherent songs, whereas Blood Incantation doesn't know how to fucking connect riffs. But getting into like the flavor of Atheist, totally respectable that they came out and they had a different take on extreme metal, and they do have, especially with this album, they do have some very traditional aspects to the sound that was going on at the time, especially with the thrash that you mentioned, Shelley. There is, a lot of thrash DNA in it, but I believe, especially nowadays, that I think the way forward is to go back to the traditional styles and then find your inner voice within those styles rather than trying to be very avant-garde, because there has to be roots. Something has to come from somewhere. Like, nothing comes from nowhere. And I think the way forward for extreme metal as a whole is to go back to the traditional forms and then find your inner voice rather than doing something completely from left field, which could be successful. But even you look at the Gorguts started out as traditional death metal, not too dissimilar from the New York style, and they went totally avant-garde. They found, they started with a traditional outlook and then found their voice and they expressed it, and it was completely, awesome the way that happened. But when we look at the bands coming up nowadays, there's a big disconnect. Everyone's trying to be avant-garde or aping like the surface level aspects, the superficial aspects of extreme metal, and I think that's where the disconnect is. I think you really have to be a traditionalist at heart, get immersed, like with painting. You learn the rules in order to break them with painting, and I think the same thing it should be in metal, where you learn the traditional forms and then you expand. You find your inner voice there, and then it could go off into a very avant-garde type of expression, but there has to be some sort of grounding, some sort of anchor that puts you firmly into traditional string metal to know the forms.
I do tend to agree, and I think a good example of what we're talking about is a band like Voivod, whose first two albums could not be more primitive thrash, but then they went very kind of off the wall, Killing Technology and Dimension Hatros even more so. But I think this discussion has kind of given me epiphany that we probably need to do a roundtable on progressive metal at some point, and I have a couple of guests or a couple of ideas for guests that I think would be very much suitable for that, because they are very, very big prog heads, not progressive metal, but prog heads, and they can give some insight into that. But I'm aware that we've spent the best part of 20 minutes on the first album, so we better move this on to a very, very much not progressive album. This is Benediction's debut, Subconscious Terror, is it? I don't even care about this band. Anyway, so yeah, Giants of British death metal.
Shelley, I rate this album as like a derpy Massacre clone.
All right. Well,
and there's actually like riffs from this album that sound like completely lifted from Massacre.
I'm sorry, Jason. Did I call on you? Did I say, Jason, what are your thoughts? I was going to fucking introduce the album, mate. Just fucking back off. Right, Benediction's bloody debut. Barney Greenway's first entry into this tier list, and he's got two, which is quite a rarity here. And we actually have 3 British death metal albums, which is even rarer for a Hate Meditations podcast tier list. Benediction's first album. Sorry, Jason, I wasn't being rude. It was just a bit of a Barney. Anyway.
No, I'm just agreeing with you that it's not a good album because it's derivative of, especially Barney Greenway. He was really influenced by Cam Lee.
Well, a lot of death metal vocalists were, as we've discussed it with Cam Lee.
It's so blatant here that they even lifted some Massacre riffs, and back then those Massacre demos were making the rounds, and Napalm Death loved them. But yeah, this is a fucking derpy Massacre clone album. So, C from Jason.
Oh, okay, all right. I've never really rated Benediction. I've seen them live many, many times. Obviously, they're very big on the UK death metal scene, which isn't really saying much because we don't have much, sort of our big hitters are grind bands that became death metal. Obviously, they are some of the bigger names in extreme metal, full stop, but I think they were better when they weren't playing death metal, i.e. Carcass, Napalm Death. Bolt Thrower being the exception that proves the rule, although their style is kind of unique. Cancer, sort of archetypical bread and butter death metal band, fun to see live, but not really anything special there. Benediction, another kind of... I wanted to sort of put them in the same category as Cancer, but after listening to this album quite a few times in preparation for this, I actually really fucking enjoyed it. And yeah, I do kind of agree with what you were saying, Jason, when you very rudely stepped in, that there is a lot of sort of the Massacre thing going on, there's the Cam Lee thing going on. But I was actually really charmed by the darkness of this album. It maintains a very kind of gothic gravitas to it that very much comes from the Hellhammer Celtic Frost tradition. There's lots of kind of weird interludes. They do lots of very heavy-handed reverb on the drums that gives this primal, barbaric kind of atmosphere to it that I found really impressive. Yeah, okay, even for 1990, it's not kind of knocking my socks off compared, given the fact that we just talked about Atheist and some of the other albums we're talking about here. But I was still sort of very much enamored by it, so I was going to put it in sort of the B tier. You've already very rudely jumped the gun and put it in the C tier. So what I'm going to do now is call on Joseph to even this fucker out.
This is definitely an album that I haven't listened a ton to. In preparation for this, I don't think I even listened to the full album, but I gave probably a good half of it a go through. I appreciated it more than I thought I would. In general, they're not a band that tend to stay on my radar. I mean, they were just at Maryland Death Fest, and I think for whatever reason, I decided to do something else rather than see them. I I mean, partially that's also just their live sets are not just pure nostalgia. They definitely go to the newer albums, and the newer albums I could definitely not care about. I think it seems like fans and death metal fans in general seem to highlight their third album, Transcending the Rubicon, as their best. And I think that probably is true.
Best cover art, at least.
Well, yeah, yeah, it's true. This one is less impressive. It's kind of an interesting historical nomener in that, yeah, Barney, this was the band before. I mean, it's funny that, like, within a year, jumping over into Napalm Death, so you can certainly hear that, and it does, I think, especially someone who like most metal fans, probably exposed to Napalm Death first and then going back to this, it kind of feels like a weird altered Napalm Death just because of Barney's voice. Like if Napalm Death had just been a pure death metal band in some ways. But I'm happy with a B position. I probably would put C. Like I feel like this is definitely in the B minus C plus range. Transcending the Rubicon I would probably put more in like a minus B plus. But yeah, I think if you're a death metal completist, it's definitely an album to check out. But it's not a classic by any stretch.
I can't do half rankings here, so I'm going to put it in the C. Jason, do you have anything to add on top of your unprecedented tirade?
No, just as derivative as, like, I hear so many war metal bands ripping off Angel Corpse and all of that, and I just think so much less of those bands, and this band doing that to Massacre, can't give it higher than a C. Very competent for what it is, but yeah, the real deal is elsewhere.
Once again, the UK is thwarted in its aspirations to be a death metal hotspot. Next up, we have Cadaver's first album. Am I still sharing? I think I am.
Yes, I see it. I see the screen, Shelly. You're sharing the tier list. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Classic Norwegian death metal now. Cadaver's first album, Hallucinating Anxiety. Now, this is a band that obviously I have listened to on and off for many years, kind of always in the context of Norwegian black metal, as most fans would do. You listen to your Old Funerals and your Thou Shalt Suffers and so on. And Cadaver are the ones that kind of stuck the course in that they're still very much connected to the infamous black metal scene, but they are the Norwegian.
Did you ever hear Vomit from Norway? Vomit?
Is that the enslaved band or?
Oh no, Vomit's always been Vomit. It had Lars, this guy named Lars, and those are the times if you ever read that book. But Lars, he actually was into death metal quite a bit. He had a rehearsal room right next to Mayhem, and but yeah, he got into drugs and nothing ever came from that. But continue on. Cadaver, I view this album as inferior to the subsequent In Pain's album, but yeah, sorry for stepping on you. The Vomit thing just really, it just entered my brain. I'm like, oh yeah, there was Vomit, and which everyone should check out and listen to the Vomit.
Yeah, so are you just going to keep interrupting these fucking intros? Like, you can introduce them if you want, you fucker. Cadaver, right.
I asked if you're drinking, and you said yes. I'm like, fuck it, I'll drink too. So,
yes, I'm drinking, which... I tend to agree, though. Okay, so shut the fuck up. I tend to agree.
Man, you have to come to Texas, and we'll get into a Texas bar fight with each other. We'll get each other's backs.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great, Jason, but you're 10 foot taller than me, so I'm not going to get into a fight with you. But anyway, Cadaver.
No, I mean, we're on the same side. It's like, we can beat up the non-metalheads. I was going to say something.
I wondered what the fuck you were going to say then. No.
When you go out in nature and you see frogs that are like red and shit, and it shows
There's the mute button. Right, I've just muted Jason. So I'm going to talk about Cadaver for a bit. I do tend to agree with his opinion that the second album, In Pains, from 1992, is the superior album, and it does happen to be our dear friend Tyler's one of his favorite death metal albums as well. I know, which is kind of why I did want to get him on this episode, but it's a little bit of a shame that he couldn't join. But this is Cadaver's debut, which is it's an interesting crossover of like the UK style of kind of death grind that was going on at the time, and the more sort of Floridian thing that was going on. And Jason mentioned Massacra earlier on. I think there is a bit of a crossover with this and the Benediction album in a lot of ways, because the album doesn't really lean into the Swedish style whatsoever, and well, not whatsoever, but it kind of eschews the thing that, you know, Entombed and Dismember and Carnage were kind of popularizing at the time, in favor of more of the death grind thing that was going on in the UK, mixed with more of the American thrash thing that was going on in America. And the thing that makes In Pain so unique is that it's got that kind of avant-garde, weird eccentricity to it, that we were discussing with a band like Atheist or Demolic or whatever, but it does it in a very subtle kind of underhand way. And you kind of hear the germinal of that in this album, but it is very sort of subliminal. It is substantively a very, very primitive, thrashy death metal album, but you kind of hear hints peppered throughout the album of like just weirdness, I guess, just death metal being a bit proto avant-garde in a lot of ways, and very, very eccentric. And it's very interesting because obviously Norwegian death metal at this time was just completely overshadowed by what the likes of Mayhem were beginning to kind of conjure up, and the idea of like a Norwegian death metal identity is kind of swallowed up by, say, Darkthrone Soulside Journey or Thou Shalt Suffer material and so on. And Cadaver kind of point a different way to marrying these two very Anglosphere elements with a more Nordic kind of sense of eccentricity and weirdness to it, which I find really interesting. But this is I sort of feel like I'm overselling it at this point. Don't go into this album expecting to hear all of that. It is a very primitive, early extreme metal sort of showcase, I suppose. So at this point, I would hand over to you, Joseph. I'm sorry, I'm just going to let Jason let off some steam, and then I will hand over. So I'm going to unmute you, Jason, and you're going to talk about Cadaver.
As a courtesy, I did not unmute myself as you were talking there, but I would give it a B tier. It is still in that proto phase. It's very more death metal-y than some of the other albums on here that still are like very proto, very thrash influence and all that, but it does have some of those quote-unquote angular thrash riffs. It's solid for what it is. I would give it a B. Cadaver with In Pains would actually realize their vision a little bit more later, but yeah, it's not a band that I hate or anything like that. It's very good, and it's, like you said, it's strange from Norway that produces a pretty decent death metal band, considering, Norway's known for black metal and not death metal, other than the first Darkthrone album. I fucking love that so much, Soulside Journey. But yeah, Joseph, I'll let you chat about Cadaver, see where you diverge, if you diverge.
Yeah, of the handful of albums on this list that I wasn't terribly super familiar with, this is one of them. And this was probably the one I liked the least. The recording has a very demo-like quality, and I don't necessarily mean that in like nihilist demos or something where you're like, oh, it's amazing. It's funny though, because Jason, you mentioned In Pains, and I feel like it's been a while since I've listened to that album, but I feel like I do actually enjoy that one. But yeah, gave this album a partial play, kind of like the Benediction one, and just really didn't like it. There are times it kind of reminds me of Darkthrone Soulside Journey, but also just in sort of a I wish I was listening to Soulside Journey instead feel. I think this should belong in probably C tier, but because of metal, the average
for 1990, and that's very respectable. I can't give it anything less than a B. It's real death metal. Like that's that 1990 phase where like I know Master is not included, but Master came out in 1990, as did a Death Strike album, Fucking Death, and both of those still had some grindcore flavors to it. Cadaver was operating in a true death metal form, which is very fucking respectable, and that's why I gave it a B. I can't see it being ranked lower than a B.
I think just purely because I like the Benediction album more, I would put it at C, but I would even potentially put it at D. Not necessarily a bad album, but just, I don't think it deserves to be higher than the Benediction debut.
Fair enough. I can kind of see that in that it doesn't embody the eeriness of Soulside Journey. I think we're all agreed that's obviously the superior album, although it came out a year later, and this is very it's not early in death metal's journey, but it's early in death metal's kind of popularity, I suppose. And Norway was obviously diverging at this point, but by 1990 it was still very kind of cards up in the air. Mayhem was still figuring out what they were doing. The big hitters of Norwegian black metal had not yet formed, or were about to form, but only just started doing a sort of different style that was sort of recognizably different and so on. So this album, I guess, is overlooked in kind of all of this fanfare and so on. But yeah, there is, like I was saying, it's sort of maybe it's the scholar's choice is what I'm getting at. I said I did promise that I'd boil your piss in this episode. Anyway, moving on. A band that is unambiguously death metal, unambiguously from Sweden, and unambiguously brief and awesome. Carnage.
Dismembered, but not dismember.
Yes, Jason. It would be nice if you waited for me to hand over to you when you come in with your little comments. Keep them in your pocket. Carnage, Dark Recollections, Dismember before they were Dismember, the right-hand man to Nihilist and Entombed and Unleashed before they all became their own different things. Carnage's Dark Recollections, it's an album that I have long had a passion for, but I keep talking about Tyler. I don't fancy the guy. He's just very, very articulate, but it's one of his favorite death metal albums, and we did discuss it at length in our focus episode on Swedish death metal. Check it out, link in the description. But yeah, this features Michael Amott, who would go on to form Arch Enemy later on. Features members of Dismember. There's a couple of tracks that found their way onto Dismember B-sides and so on. The thing I love about this album, I think I love it more, and this is probably going to tee us up or foreshadow what we're coming to. I think I love it more than something like Left Hand Path, just because it embodies the same... The glory of Swedish death metal of this era, especially the HM Boss pedal thing, that guitar, the buzzsaw guitar tone, the glory of that style at its peak was its ability to convey that muscular power combined with this dark, ethereal, gothic energy to it that, as much as I love a plethora of American or US death metal, is kind of lacking in a lot of it, with the exception of maybe a Morbid Angel or so on, in that a Carnage, the riffs are basic as fuck. There's a lot of D-beat punk in there. There's a lot of primitive thrash. There's obviously a crossover of things like Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, sort of goes without saying. But they engage in a project... anyone that knows me will know I'm about to say this, but they engage in a project of world building. They convey more than the sum of their parts through these very sort of primitive droning chords over these sort of basic backbeats and so on. It's very, very simple, very austere, but the atmosphere kind of swells around you and kind of engulfs you in a lot of ways, and that's what I love about early Dismember, early Entombed, early Carnage, and maybe to a lesser extent Unleashed. I think they achieve that at some points, but they're not on the sort of docket tonight, so we're not really going to discuss them. But this Carnage album is probably the archetype of that. The riffs are very primitive. There's not really anything obviously kind of there's not any showstoppers going on. There's not like an obvious sort of finale in the same way that you'd get from an Immolation track or the Morbid Angel at their best, where it's like, here's the centerpiece that the track is going to fix it round. It kind of just drones on. But as you let the music swell over you, it just creates this ambient kind of this downbeat vibe that just swallows you whole in a lot of ways, and that's what I love about it. And it's them using that guitar tone to ambient effect in a way that, you know, black metal would do with its own use of textures and guitar tones, and it would use riffs to kind of manipulate that in a sort of hypnotic way. And that's what I really come to appreciate about this album. And it's not something that obviously jumps out at you at the outset, but repeated listens to this and the early Nihilist demos, and Grotesque as well, I should probably chuck them in there as well, kind of really does sort of captivate you to a great extent. So I'm going to hand to Joseph first, because Jason's being a naughty piggy. I'm going to put this in A, by the way. In S, sorry. By the way, go on. So.
Oh. No, I think that was really well said about Carnage. We are probably going to get in some disagreements in 3 albums from now, just given what you mentioned in reference to another band. But I do really enjoy this album. I don't return to it as much as I should, and I don't return to it as much as I do to Dismember, who are certainly one of my favorite death metal bands. And in a way, you can, I mean, other than one member, it's essentially Dismember. So in a lot of ways, it should, in a certain sense, be thought of as like a proto-Dismember album. In the same way Nihilist...
Member and then Dismember? It's like you're severing the penis, sorry.
There's definitely wordplay to be had. No, that's true. But yeah, I think it's great. It has... maybe even more than like an Everflowing Stream or some of the later Dismember albums. It has kind of a dark gothic quality, and I don't mean that in like a Sisters of Mercy way necessarily, but in that kind of black metal darkness sort of sense, which makes it very attractive. And actually, I would kind of compare in some ways to a later album, especially when this album hits more of a mid-pace. And kind of taps into that more creepy or menacing kind of vibe. I think it's quite good. On the same hand, in comparison to all the albums we're viewing, I wouldn't still, again, probably because I don't go to it as much as Dismember, I wouldn't necessarily put in S tier, but I think without a doubt it is A tier. But that's more just sort of it in relation to other albums. It being an S tier, I would not complain, but I would put it at A.
Yeah, I probably should have said before I had to Jason as well, if we're considering this like the debut Dismember album, Like a Flowing Stream is up there with...
Yeah, and one thing, because I'm not sure it would be mentioned, but it's very interesting that, you know, the one character in to Carnage that sets us apart from Dismember is Michael Amott, who would go on to quite immediately after this join Carcass, and very much was part of Carcass's probably biggest, most mainstream, or at least what would become their most remembered albums, and then go on to form Arch Enemy, and in some ways credit for starting melodic death metal. So it's interesting seeing where that comes from, and where in a different combination his influence shows in an album like this. But yeah, it's good. I would put it A, but S would not complain.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
Well, I would say it's S tier 100%. I don't see how it could be A tier at all. Well, I really don't, because the riffs and the Carnage make fucking sense, and like you said, it's like this atmosphere that creates a vibe. But there's more going on than that. It actually communicates something very profound, like the first Dismember album. And yeah, I really enjoyed revisiting this album, and nothing but respect from Jason. I think that the Michael Amott guy who did Arch Enemy was a fucking idiot for not sticking to his fucking roots. He went and sold out and, you know, created fucking mass appeal, adornment, you know, just consumerist music. He should have stuck to his guns, and what he was doing with Carnage was fucking phenomenal. S tier all the way.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't think Michael Amott has any regrets because he has had a very successful career, but yeah, he's sort of a controversial figure, shall we say, in some circles, because some would blame him for the decline of Carcass from what they were, but also Arch Enemy are quite a formative band for me in that one of their albums that was released in the early 2000s kind of got me into this whole thing anyway, and discovering early Arch Enemy and by extension Carcass. You could sort of, you could slice it either way, but we won't get into that. We'll get into something that I've no doubt we will all agree amicably on: death, spiritual healing. So, this is, I want to say it's the best Death album, but also the album that kind of made Death who they are, which is a band that I don't really get on with. I love Scream Bloody Gore. I think it's a fantastic kind of early sort of raucous riot through death metal at its most sort of unabashed, unshameful. Like you look at comparable albums from that time. Excuse me, early Sepultura, Hellhammer, Possessed. Even you can sort of lump in Bathory at that time as well, because there wasn't really those distinctions. But early extreme metal, I kind of put it in that category. Ditto Leprosy. Everyone sort of lambasts Leprosy because it's got an awful snare drum sound. I actually really like the snare drum sound. Being a fan of industrial, I just give me a snare drum that sounds like a shotgun going off in a hangar. I fucking love it. I think the album itself, it's kind of basic, sort of run-of-the-mill thrash, but I think it gets by on sheer fun and kind of energy alone, and it does have some bangers in there. It's not up there with Altars of Madness, but I don't know many people that are claiming that. And then you get to Spiritual Healing, which is when Death became sophisticated, which is when, I don't think anyone could argue that they did become sophisticated. They polished up their sound. They became much more technically adept. The production itself is much, much cleaner. The riffs are much tighter and so on. And yeah, the lineup is kind of solidified. They become what you will see on the progressive death metal albums. But this is not a progressive death metal album, I don't think. It's got sort of that element to it. It's got some technical elements to it, but I think most people would agree it's more of just a very, very competent, maybe quasi-complex death metal album, in the same way that something like Altars of Madness was. And I think they do a really good job of like containing that within what are quite anthemic moments. Like Chuck is he's not the best death metal vocalist going at the time. He's not, David Vincent. He's not bloody Frank Mullen. He just has his voice, but he is quite good at articulating an anthemic chorus, and there is that heavy metal influence kind of swelling through him, in that he does want the catch-all chorus. And I think in that regard it is quite fun at times, and there's some really catchy solos. I think people blow their load over this album because it is that bit more technical and that bit more proficient musically than a lot of the albums we're discussing on this list. You even look at Atheist Piece of Time, which is the progressive death metal album, which is more technical and more complex than Spiritual Healing, but it is sloppier in execution because Chuck was just that bit more into his career than Atheists were at this time. I think actually maybe that's not fair, but Chuck was just more experienced in the studio, should we say. So he kind of gets the accolades for kind of developing that. But I think what I'm trying to say in way too many syllables is this is a good, fun death metal album. Don't overrate it, but also don't underrate it, Jason.
Well, Shelley, I appreciate your enthusiasm. Some of it I may think is derived from you drinking some alcohol. So I've probably spent some more time with this album than you have. It was one of my first death metal albums that I got back when I was 12.
I'm gonna stick it as a B, by the way. Sorry, Jason, carry on.
Nothing higher than a B at all. But there are some elements that we need to consider at this album. What really holds it back? Yes, Chuck can write some compelling riffs, but the way they're connected is just really confused. yes, it is. He's trying to be more proggy and all that, but it's just like there's just random ideas that could be split into numerous songs, all put into the same song, and there's some moments on this album I'm like, what the fuck is your fucking issue, Chuck? Like, you do not know how to fucking construct a song. There's no coherent flow to it at all. It's just riffs that sound cool in isolation, not how they communicate to each other. And I didn't really like this album back when I was 12 and 13, and I listened to it all the fucking time. I had a fucking patch of this fucking album on my backpack for school. And it really took me, sitting down with Morbid Angel and better bands to realize, like, there's really not much going on with the death. And with the death, there is no death sound. Like, a friend of mine said that, the Massacre people created a death sound on Leprosy. But when you look at each death album, there's a completely different expression going on. There's no, like with Morbid Angel, you can tell how each album is either a progression or a regression. It's the same individuals, same people. Like Domination is obviously the selling out album, whereas, you can tell the downfall with Morbid Angel, whereas with Death, they changed the personnel so much that yes, you do have some flavors of Chuck in each album, but the atmosphere, what they're creating in totality is completely different album to album. And on this album, we have James Murphy, who is also on the Obituary album that we're going to review later. And it's just so fucking disjointed in some spots that it's hard to actually rank this, because yes, there's a lot of really cool riffs in it, a lot of cool parts, but the songs themselves fucking suck, how they're constructed. And that in itself is reason to not ever fucking listen to this. I do not like that Death is so popular. Like Death, it's like people say like Chuck created death metal, like people who don't really know death metal because he named the band Death. And there's this huge fucking disconnect. Like, Chuck always had this surface level take on death metal. And look at Scream Bloody Gore. Yes, it's a fun thrash proto death metal album, right? But it's very surface level. It's very superficial. Like Zombie Ritual and all that. It's just, like we saw Evil Dead in the movie theater. Let's write a song about that. But like the authentic stuff, which Chuck has said in interviews that he hates, that people are too extreme, like the Trays cutting himself on stage, wanting to raise the elder gods because they actually believe in that shit. You do need that monomaniacalism to succeed. And Chuck did not have that. It was and he got into social commentary later. And it's just not really fucking, he's the worst fucking representative of extreme metal. Yes, it's a gateway because they are fucking popular.
Well,
it's
okay.
a gateway band because they are fucking popular.
Okay.
But gateways exist to walk through, to leave behind. And this album is fucking...
Okay, yeah, I kind of take your point that gateways are there to walk through, and yeah, you could make the same point around Dimmu Borgir or whatever for black metal, but in some sense it still does inform people's understanding in some way. I'm not really saying that because I want to debate with you, because I know that the more it informs people's understanding, the more it kind of degenerates the genre. But I do think that, as you said in your comments then, that Chuck, like, he has a style. I could tell a Chuck riff in the same way that I could tell a Trey riff. It's just that he couldn't connect the dots in the same way that a Trey could, or a Bob Vigner could in the same way. So I'm debating with you, but I do want to get you come back on that, Jason, then we'll go to Joseph.
Spiritual Healing could have been fucking phenomenal. Had it incubated longer, had they self-edited themselves, it could have been a fucking phenomenal album. But the ingredients there and how the songs are constructed is just not true death metal in my eyes. I'm sorry. Joseph April may have differing opinion, of course, because he likes Blood Incantation, and this album has a lot of riff salad parts, as does the Blood Incantation.
Joseph may have a different opinion because he's a discerning metal fan that has different opinions to you.
There's a lot of riff salad in the spiritual healing, just like that Blood Incantation. So, Joseph, take it away.
Well, where to begin? Okay, just my experience with this album. I think my introduction to death was the last album, Sound of Perseverance, which is probably these days the album I least return to, and kind of I have odd feelings about that album. And then weirdly, just I think because of what was available at record stores, I was able to find Spiritual Healing was my second, so it was kind of quite a move back into the discography. So at the time, I certainly fell in love with it, but then once the full Death discography I had in my hands, I kind of reevaluated it. It's not probably one of my top 3 Death albums. At the same time, I think it's quite good. It does seem to be kind of a harbinger of a transition in the band, where it's maybe their last of the early death metal scene, because obviously, right after this, I think is a clear hallmark of them going into the progressive death metal scene with Human. At the same time, this is rather technical. You can feel some of the technical thrash influences at play. I'm pretty sure Chuck was a big Watchtower fan.
He was, yeah.
So I think you can definitely feel that a bit here. Maybe not quite as much in Human, but in Human, I think you get a whole bunch of other things and so on. But you get a very long song in the title track. It's over 7 minutes. I think that was a new thing for Death. So it's this sort of transitional album. It also is the only Death album with James Murphy, who is probably one of the most famous kind of hired guns. I mean, a guy who kind of shows up in bands here and there, and usually at a time when they do pretty great work. Although I do think probably in the death metal scene,
which bands, Joseph?
Death is so
you listen to that Disincarnate. That's fucking riff salad too. You listen to. Are you talking about like Testament? Like him being in Testament? That's like him being at the peak. Because early Testament's better than later Testament. Like they're
well, I mean, these 2 albums in particular, but I mean, just that he's not sort of a metal musician who was associated with one band in particular, that he kind of jumped around a fair bit. Obviously, Steve DiGiorgio would be associated probably first with Sadus, but he's sort of another guy who has been in a bunch of different bands. Also, James Murphy, also being a cancer survivor, which I think he was diagnosed.
He was in the band Cancer as well.
Yeah, that too, ironically. Another interesting thing with this album is the album art for this and Leprosy are both Ed Repka, who is most associated with the thrash metal scene, in particular Megadeth. At the same time, they're very kind of trademark album covers, a lot of visual kind of elements going on, but at the same time, not like Dan Seagrave, where it's sort of these deep little intricacies. It's more sort of these bold kind of images.
It's almost sort of satirical on American life. Like I've always
very political.
Actually, almost one of my favorite things about Spiritual Healing is the cover because it's so striking.
Yeah. It's weirdly, it's sort of, it's definitely an image that plays into something that I often take issue with in American life, the whole sort of televangelist sort of thing that played in, and certainly was even more prevalent in American culture in the 80s. But yeah, it's a striking image with that. Like, it's almost sort of like, an image taken straight out of like Metallica's Leper Messiah or something like that. And But yeah, to wrap it up, so we're not talking about still got more than half to go through. I enjoy it. If we were doing a death tier list, this would be on kind of the lower scale for me. I think Leprosy for the early material is probably my favorite, and Human for the more progressive side is my favorite. It's still, I think, a really good album. I think it's a goddamn travesty if we put it right next to Cadaver. So I would say A, but strategically I'm going to say S because goddamn it, if it's next to Cadaver, fuck.
Do you know what, Joseph? I'm feeling... Jason, I know you've unmuted. I don't care what you're going to say. I think it's a goddamn travesty with picking next to it.
It is a travesty. Shelley, do not stand your ground, Shelley. Stand your ground. It's a bad album. B tier at best. You know what? I'm ranking it C. Okay.
Do you know what?
I'm ranking it C.
All right. Just put Cadaver on A then. Do you know what? I need a piss so bad that you've ground me down. So I'm going to keep it on the A. I'm going to go for a wee, and then we're going to reconvene very quickly.
I'll smoke. I'll be back.
That's all right, guys. Okay. Do you ever have a piss where it's like as satisfying to me as coming as having sex with a woman coming?
We should have recorded that for this.
Oh, we're still on record, I think.
Okay, we can throw that one in.
Sorry, I really needed
that.
Okay,
I'm changing my ranking to C. That way it's in a B for spiritual killer.
Just let me pour my beer. Hang on.
Oh, if we do that, then I put Cadaver in D.
Guys, come on, play nice.
I just don't like that album.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Right. Cool. Yeah. Deicide's Deicide. Their first album that fell into 1990. It's one of those albums that's been in my life for so long that I sort of struggle to articulate what's going on. But we've discussed Legion at length as sort of one of the silverbacks of death metal, quay death metal. We sort of, we talk about Atheist and Demolic as still doing something a bit brainy with it, but Deicide were very good at just articulating the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the platonic form of what death metal should be, a little bit like Incantations to Golgotha.
You're ripping off Jason by saying that.
Yeah, sorry. That comment was trademarked Jason. Jason was the one that originated the thought of Incantations to Golgotha being the archetypical sort of death metal album in a lot of ways. Sorry, Jason, I should have credited you with that. Deicide's debut, by contrast, is a different beast, and I think the reason is because Deicide's Legion kind of washes over you. Like, I know in each individual track, but it works much more as a whole in a sort of similar way to black metal, in that it's just a unified experience. Whereas Deicide's debut is much more anthemic. There are moments where it's just sort of punches out you, and it's like, oh yeah, it's like listening to fucking Slayer or some old school heavy metal, but just rendered in death metal form in a lot of ways. And I was listening to this yesterday in my garden with my son, who's not even 2 years old, and he was just sort of bopping along to a lot of it. He was trying to twerk as a 2-year-old can, but just along to some of the beats because they're that groovy, and that he's just learned about.
Have you thought about putting your son on Netflix?
No, Jason, I haven't.
Netflix likes the babies twerking.
Yeah, there's a reason he's not even on social media. But because there's so many sort of mid-paced moments, they sort of they have these. The Deicide have these really intense like blasting moments, but there's lots of like mid-paced moments or just anthemic moments or moments that could be in a fucking pop song, but they're just so outrageously aggressive and obscene, in that way that only Glenn Benton can be, that they just kind of, they're almost humorous in a way, but not in a way that it denigrates the music. It's just this perfect combination of fucking death metal at its most fun, but its most profound. And I think that's what I love about it. For me, black metal is a very sober, very kind of quasi-religious experience, whereas death metal at its best, and I'm thinking Deicide, I'm thinking Obituary, I'm thinking a lot of the American bands in particular, they managed to combine that sense of profundity with a sense of fun. And I don't mean that to sort of be what's the word, cheapen the experience in any way, but fun in a sort of Dionysian sense of just being very intoxicated, just being like, fuck me, like this is invigorating and physical and visceral in a lot of ways. And I think the Deicide debut captures that in so many ways, and each track has these standout moments that I always forget about, and when they come along it's like, oh fuck, this is like just, yeah, it's like listening to Slayer's Rain in Blood in a lot of ways. It's that brief, and it's that powerful, and it's that compact and that efficient in the way it executes exactly what it wants to do. And I think the fact that it's their debut album, I know they had some demos as Amon and then Deicide and so on. This wasn't sort of their first run at it, but the fact that they came right out of the gate with this debut and just expressed that, and sadly never managed to repeat it, but I think that makes it all the more profound. So it won't surprise you that this is going in the S tier. I feel like I keep picking on Jason because he is being an obnoxious little cunt, but I'm going to pick on Joseph again because I think I know what Jason's going to say.
You know, cunt is a bad word in English. That's a really bad, like in American English. They say that in America, people are going to be like looking at you weird. But yeah.
Well, I'm English and my channel is English, so I can say.
Well, I'm saying American English.
Well, I'm English, so shut up.
Get on the American bandwagon. You're just ranked a American death metal album in S tier. You should be a little bit American.
Jason, you're a lovely cunt, but fuck off.
Do we dive into the etymology and history of cunt? It's quick sidebar. It's actually one of my favorite curse words, and I'm happy that some Australian and British comics have made it slightly more accessible in the States than its traditional forbiddenness over here. Anyway, Dias.
Do you get it? Because doesn't cunt mean female vagina?
Yeah, but it, in the same way that you call someone a prick or dickhead.
Do you get it often? Do you get the cunts often?
Probably not as much as I would like.
All right.
Rolling in pussy. Anyway, Joseph.
Well, that's what Shelley is. Anyway, God, these sidebars. Yeah, Deicide's debut is probably my favorite Deicide album. I do enjoy Legion. Actually seeing the band recently, 2022, play all of Legion live was extremely impressive. And I do enjoy some albums after that. Once Upon the Cross, I think, is pretty good. Slightly underrated from the discography. That said, after that, things get a little... But the first album is the one I return to the most. I think, Shelley, you very well said how the songs on it particularly stand out in a way that's a bit different from Legion. Legion just sort of feels like almost like one... It almost could be that like one song album where everything just kind of is this one thing on one mission, whereas the songs in Deicide, they all sort of stand out in certain ways, at least a fair number of them. Like Dead by Dawn is one of my favorite, and again, the movie it's referencing, the Evil Dead one, is one of my favorites, so that always stands out, and the shouting chorus is a very nice touch connecting to that movie. Also, what is it? Sacrificial Suicide is one of my favorite tracks. Also, I always have to give a shout out to a band who does a self-titled album with a self-titled song. I think that's always a nice little wink.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great album. At the same time, like, would I rank Deicide as an S-tier death metal band? Probably not, but again, that's a lot of what came afterward, kind of mixing into it. But if we're just judging on what came out in 1990, if we had other people pulling this down, I would say it would be a crime to put it anything lower than an A, S. I'm very comfortable seeing that. So if Jason says S, I'm perfectly fine with it being there. Or
just before Jason comes in, I should have clarified this hours ago on the rankings, but we're not ranking it against All Music Ever. We're ranking it on
just this year,
the list in front of us.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously, if we go 91, 92, better death metal albums were made. But
I mean, certainly so far, I listened to Deicide's debut more than than the two albums we have in A tier. So yeah, I'm comfortable with either in S tier or ahead of the other two in A tier.
Okay, Jason.
I don't know. I'm being censored today. Of course, it's fucking S tier. I fucking, out of all these albums, this is the one I reconnected with the most. And I fucking love it. I love, I know Joseph mentioned some other titles, but Crucifixation. I fucking love the brief melodic solo that comes in there for a split second and just leaves. Everything he said about the Slayer influence is certainly there with this debut album from Deicide. Complete S tier from Jason. I love every fucking second of it. I think it's on par with Legion. Now, after spending more time with it and revisiting, now I'm older. The two are shoulder to shoulder, in my opinion. Both are S tier albums, which is blasphemy to the Morbid Angel crowd, because I mentioned earlier on the podcast that some members of Morbid Angel had Deicide shirts on their doormats so people would wipe their feet on Deicide. That's just privy, information to, the inner workings and the competition. And the competition's very healthy there, which we need more of in today's metal. There should be more competition. We should call a spade and, get on, with not just your own expression, but also to the broader atmosphere of what's happening. And, I think Morbid Angel is certainly the best, death metal band ever, but Deicide is, right up there, trying to, topple the throne with the early two albums, at least. Trey is certainly more forward-thinking and more of a intuitive, I would say. Like Deicide, you could say, is really extroverted in constant aggression and all that, whereas Morbid Angel is more inward focused, more thoughtful and all that. But both expressions I feel are great, and nothing less than an S tier from Jason.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd say it's like the difference between Slayers, Hell Awaits, and Rain in Blood in a lot of ways, in that they're just different experiences, but they're both sort of seminal albums in the same way that Deicide, in a short space of time, created two very, very different experiences, but both timeless in their own right. Next up, we have Entombed. Have you heard of Entombed? I don't know these guys. Band. They released an album called Left Hand Path.
This band supposedly was on the coattails of Dismember, if I remember correctly.
Fair enough. Yeah, I've not come across it before. So yeah, they released an album called Left Hand Path back in 1990. What's the word? Paragon of Swedish death metal. Although I've gone on record saying I actually prefer Clandestine. But like I said, I do intend to boil your piss tonight. Left Hand Path is obviously, though, regardless of my preference for Clandestine, Left Hand Path is obviously a sort of unignorable death metal album. I did very much enjoy re-listening to it in preparation for this episode. I think the problem it has, and I'm going to go into its problems before I sing its praises, but the problem it has is sort of first comer syndrome, sort of that first arrival thing, where it almost tries to do too much on arrival, in that it's trying to conglomerate what was the very early death metal scene, that, collecting together the Nihilist demos. They were just riling from the split that created Unleashed and so on, trying to combine that with competing with what they knew was going on in Florida, and trying to also kind of combat this greater sort of sense of theatre and gothic melodrama that was going on within extreme metal, particularly European extreme metal at the time, whilst also kind of maintaining a connection with the roots of like DB punk and thrash and Slayer and so on. And for an album that's sort of, I'm not saying the band were consciously trying to do this, but I think that was some of the sort of peripheral pressures that were on the early Swedish scene at the time. And I think something like Left Hand Path basically compresses all of that and sort of splurts it at you, even within the first fucking song. In that you do get this very, very intense extreme metal experience, but it sort of devolves into this orchestral flowing Exorcist-esque horror score, Michael Oldfield horror-esque score, and so on. And as the album progresses, it becomes more punk, it becomes more thrashy, but it maintains, much like the Carnage album that we discussed, it maintains that sense of gothic theatre that I think most Swedish death metal managed to embody in a lot of ways. And I think given the pressure that was not... Okay, I'm imposing a teleology on this album that probably didn't exist at the time, but given the pressure that we retrospectively thrust on this album, I think it still holds up. Like, it is still a outstanding slab of death metal in its own right, regardless of when it was released or whatever. And the fact that so many bands since this time have tried to basically ape its calling cards, ape its aesthetic, ape the riffs that are on it, is kind of testament to that. Unlike something like Atheist, where although there's been a lot of progressive metal bands, I don't think any band really sounds quite like Atheist. Entombed, a little bit like Bolt Thrower, a little bit like Suffocation. They just have the first comer curse in that just so many bands try to imitate them to the point where you just get sick of the sound, and to the point where you just get sick of listening to the genuine article. But we can't forget this is 1990, and just there weren't those hordes back in the day. So yeah, fantastic album, absolutely seminal. That was a very meandering way of me saying that, but I don't think it's even Entombed's best. So I'm going to rank it as an A, which is, by the way, it's very, very high, but I'm going to put it as an A. I'll go to you, Jason, first, because I'm more interested to know what you're going to say, because I think I know what Joseph's going to say.
Right. Of course, you know that I'm more in the Dismember camp than the Entombed. I view Left Hand Path as a really good gateway album because there are a lot of, calling cards of death metal in it, but also the strongest track, the final track of the album, has that phantasm melody in it, which they've kind of, become known for. But it all seems very surface level to me. There's still the verse chorus stuff. There's, it's the scream bloody gore of Sweden. And I view that Dismember did it so much better than even the Carnage, than the Entombed, which I know is blasphemy. Like, Entombed's held up just like Death is. But when you actually analyze the songs and try to pinpoint true death metal expression, it's not in the Entombed, it's not in the Death. So as such, I can only place it at highest to B. I think Joseph's opinion will diverge from my own because it's a very anthemic, quote-unquote, death metal album, but it's all the surface-level aspects of death metal, which they do really well. It's very well executed, but still, when it comes to the true expression of death metal, which encompasses the scary aspects like Morbid Angel and all that, Entombed, they're comic books. That's why they did Wolverine Blues. They're a comic book level take on death metal, and I can only give it a B at best. I'm sorry.
I promised you piss. I promised you boiling. What can I say? Joseph.
Just as a note, the Wolverine comic book thing was the label's doing, not the band. I'm going to say this is S tier. This is one of my top 5 death metal albums. I think it's one of the best. In some ways, it's kind of cheating because it is about a third to maybe almost half of it is Nihilist albums. So it's essentially the best of Nihilist kind of buffed up, and then what they did immediately after that. If Nihilist had never broken up, this probably would have been the second... Well, essentially would have been the first Nihilist album. So in that way, it is kind of the culmination of what was the tip of the spear of the Swedish death metal scene. The title track, which is not a Nihilist track, though is maybe one of my favorites, comes in absolutely savage. Even more so in Clandestine, they use a lot of movie samples, which that track does as well. And that's always an element I find playfully fun with metal bands, and especially bands from the 90s did it quite well. But and then halfway through that song, it all of a sudden goes into this slower pace, this kind of mid to slow pace, does kind of become very anthemic, sort of a kind of Candlemass slow doom march kind of thing, which I think really adds a great atmosphere to it. The songs stand out. A lot of them definitely have a D-beat kind of punk influence. There's a lot of GBH, I think, kind of showing up, even more so than I think Discharge.
GBH, is that Graham Belial's hand?
Grievous
no,
bodily
no,
harm.
Jason. It's a very, very famous British punk band. Yeah, GBH also being a big influence on Bathory. I think it's funny because I think the American scene, GBH never played too much of an influence, but on the Swedish metal scene, for whatever reason, maybe because of record deals and stuff becoming more available, it's interesting to note how much GBH seemed to be an influence on everyone from Quorthon to Nicky Anderson. But yeah, not to just go on and on and on. I think it's a fantastic album. S tier, but I guess average out to A, I will tolerate. But yeah, for me, it's S.
That is a completely legitimate ranking for one of the most beloved classics of death metal. How dare you? So, speaking of grievous bodily harm, next up we have Impetigo. Impetigo? Is that how you pronounce it? Impetigo.
I always said Impetigo.
Oh.
Impetigo.
But it's pronounced Impetigo. Anyway.
Impetigo.
Ultimo Mondo Cannibal. Right. So this is not going to rank as highly as the Entombed. You'll be shocked to learn, but I kind of fucking love this kind of album where it's not strictly speaking death metal. It's more of like a gore grind album. And this is basically, I've liked this band for quite a long time just because they're fucking fun. I sort of rank them on the same wavelength as sort of Nuclear Death. They're kind of like a less sophisticated Blood, and they very much in that sort of the same kennel as Mortician, in that you get really long samples, far too long. Like if you just want to watch a horror film, just watch a fucking horror film. I don't need half the fucking song to be a sample from a horror film, but it is fun to sometimes get these in there and then just sort of go into some sort of blasting death grind or whatever. The thing I like about them is that they are so anarchic and disruptive and similar to what I was saying with Deicide, just fucking fun, but they're much less structured about it. It's much more just sloppy and all over the place. The thing that Blood do much better is they get across a much more sophisticated sort of atmospheric sense of nihilism, I suppose. They're just Blood are much more creepy and they get under your skin in a way that something like this doesn't. It's kind of the equivalent of watching a sort of standard B-movie horror film and then watching a genuinely good horror film that is psychologically disruptive, like sort of like The Thing or something, and then just watching Cannibal Holocaust, which is this album is representing, which it has its place, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. It's sort of, if we're going to sort of do equivalence, it's sort of the similar thing in that this, drink some beers, you just want to listen to some blasting death grind, Impetigo fit the fucking bill, but they're not really going to do much more than that. It pains me to put them next to Cadaver because I think the Cadaver album is actually much better, but I do think it's more than a C tier, so I'm going to put it on the B, and then I don't know which one. You both begin with J, so Jason, go for it.
I mean, I can give it over to Joseph if you want. Like you were complaining I chimed in too much.
I was complaining you chimed in too much. That's because you chimed in too much. But now I'm inviting you to chime in.
Well, Joseph, you go. I'm making it good. I'm making everything good.
You don't need to be a little bitter sour about it. Just chime in when I ask you, you fucking pussy.
Well, Well, my sentiments are exactly the same as yours. This is more of a grind album than death metal, but it does have its charm and is competent for what it does, and it's specifically from the period that it comes from. This, you had Repulsion and all that, coming out a couple of years earlier, and yeah, the Impetigo. If I'm mispronouncing that, correct me. That's always how I pronounce it, but yeah, it's solid for what it is. It's like C tier to me is just like complete confusion. Um, they can write some songs or some riffs and complete confusion, but B tier is actually an expression that they're conveying. And Impetigo certainly has that for me, so it's a B tier from Jason. Yes, it is what you said, gore grind or whatever, but I think it's more of like a mixture of grindcore and early proto death metal with a lot of horror aspects, in there. So that's my ranking is B. Go ahead, Joseph.
Well, since I got broach, I guess I should say like my mentality in the terms of the meta aspect of the rankings. I wasn't necessarily thinking of C as being a bad category. Then again, in general, like grading, there's usually not S, like A is the top. So I could see the argument that anything below a B isn't really up to snuff. But I guess I was just thinking anything in C as being like, okay, that's an average album, considering that a C is, at least in academic circles, well, when grading students is essentially, okay, you did the average. But to talk about the album, yeah, this isn't one of the ones I was not super familiar with. I know some people talk about this band with quite a bit of reverence. I think the influence is certainly noticeable in terms of, the gross outness in death metal. The comparison, which obviously the band makes blatant with something like the cannibal films, the Italian horror of that, is very plain, and those movies again aren't, as someone who loves horror movies, those aren't really my favorites, because it does seem to be just a focus on gross. But at the same time, it's very playful, it's very anarchic, as mentioned. The vocals are absolutely wild. At times it feels like a kindergartner being told to do death metal, which at the very least you can appreciate in terms of its lack of feeling structured. Like it has a child sort of like anything can happen-ness to it, which I think can be appreciated. But yeah, I don't have a lot to say because I don't have much history with this album. I'm fine with it being in B, but honestly I feel like it probably deserves to be in C. It gets points for, certainly at the time, being original, being art, in doing its thing. But out of all the albums we're looking at, this is one I would be the least likely to return to.
Okay, I think that's what I'm getting at. It's just, no.
Like I would listen to Benediction every day over this.
Yeah, okay. I'm getting like no props for originality, but
Shelly, I just looked at my notes. I'm sorry I've neglected them because I wrote these notes because I knew I'd be drinking, but actually I ranked them C tier when I was listening to it. So.
Oh no, that means I'm outvoted.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I mean, what I was going to say is, like, I have a soft spot for this anarchic kind of, as you said, Joseph, anything can happen. I kind of love that unbridled feeling, especially with these early releases. But I was comparing this to Blood because I keep thinking Blood is what happens when this kind of music gets distilled into an intentionality, in the same way that Deicide or whatever, it's like that raw chaos, but distilled into something that is purposeful. And this is what you get when that's not the case, in a similar way that Nuclear Death or like Mortician or those kind of bands where it's just sort of all over the place. It's fun to listen to in the same way that a sloppy B movie is fun to watch, but you're not getting anything more than what we've got up the S and A tier. yeah, so that makes sense. I protest. I think it should be B, but I am outvoted. Let's move on to the French.
Well, Chili, if you're really adamant about the B tier, I will raise my ranking.
No, you don't have to do that. I'm more adamant about
Actually, like,
just.
we were chatting about it, I had more fond memories, but when I was actually listening to it, I thought C tier. But looking back on it while I'm now listening to it, it's like, yeah, it's a B.
Okay. Well, if I'm disgusted by the rankings of the next few albums, I will revisit it because I have control over the tier list. But right now, we're going to talk about Final Holocaust by Massacra, the death metal band from France. Now, this is...
Bonjour, Chili.
Bonjour.
Anthony Grey Poupon.
So this is an album that sort of a certain website has recommended it highly to me. So I've listened to it for many, many years, probably longer than you have, dear listener, and I absolutely fucking love it. But it is also its charms don't really strike you as very obvious because it is basically a very, very busy version of death thrash, like what Sadus are doing, a bit like later 80s Slayer, early Master, maybe even Massacre, the American version, the Floridian version, chuck that in there as well. Although these guys, being French, they had to be much more frantic about it, a bit more eccentric about it, and there is some terrible, terrible sort of English translations going on pre-Google Translate. But the ethos of it, the spirit is, I'd say it's sort of, it's... I don't know if this is an idea that Tyler put in my head or if I've just come off it on top of my head, but it's comparable to something like Morbid Visions, but much more amped up, much more technically proficient, the production is much more beefed up. So you're basically getting the last gasp of thrash metal in a lot of ways. And a little bit like Sadus sometimes feels like that, in that like this has to be the jumping off point of thrash when it just dies and it becomes death metal. Massacra come in and just sort of say we're still basically a thrash metal band because all of the songs are very linear. There's no kind of weird meandering stuff. There are tempo changes, but it's all da 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 da. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going to happen next. We're going to chop and change, but not in the way that someone like a Suffocation were or an Atheist were or whatever. They're not sort of winding or binding or twisting their way around. They're just very, very direct with it. But you couldn't really justifiably call it thrash because it is just that bit more violent and extreme. And that makes it such an interesting album. But I would say I would rank this as an S tier all the way, but I'd say that from the point of view of someone that's like an extreme metal scholar, in that they love the crossover between when thrash was handing the baton over to death metal, but also in France's own sort of standing within extreme metal. In that at this point in 1990, it hadn't really played a part until black metal was to play a big part. It wasn't really going to do so until like 96, 97, when the La Legion Noire and all of the smelly corpse painted cheese was about to come out. Was sorry, it's because I'm English, I can say offensive things about the French, sorry, but when all of that was about to come out, but by 1990 the French hadn't really fucking played a role, and this was one of the few albums and one of the few bands that did, but it was quite a pivotal, sort of profound little pocket that they kind of sort of inserted themselves into, and I don't think it was appreciated at the time. I still don't think it's appreciated now. I think it's an absolutely fantastic album, but that was a very meandering way of me trying to justify my love of this album. But Joseph, what do you think?
I knew this would be another outlier for me. I've never really been very fond of this album. I can, in an academic sense, very much understand its appreciation. Just, it's very much what they're doing isn't something that really appeals to my personal aesthetics. You mentioned busy, and I feel like often when I listen to this band, busy is something that kind of comes up. There's not enough sort of change in pace. It often feels like it's just trying to speed bullet as quickly as possible while still being extremely technically proficient, especially in that kind of thrash metal kind of way. I could see that they're talented what they're doing. It just doesn't really appeal to me. Like, I think I come more from sort of an Autopsy sort of appreciation. I like it when bands change the pace and slow things down a bit. I mean, get fast for sure, but it's so for me, if this were my own personal rankings, I'd probably put it at B. But yeah.
Okay, Jason.
Well, Mr. Shelley, I concur with everything that you said, but the problem with this album is there's a lot of verse-chorus aspects to it where it is a little too informed by thrash metal and by proxy rock music as a whole. But the spirit is fucking great. I fucking love this album. And because I am working with Frenchmen in my black metal project, and they fucking rank this as S tier, I'm going to rank it as an S tier. But I love the spirit. I love everything that's coming from this album, but there's some song structure issues where it's just verse, chorus, and a lot of the songs. And I feel in a true death metal framework that's unneeded, where that's like rock music. Death metal is its own expression, and rock music, that's boomer fucking shit. So, but embodying the spirit of those behind my own music project, I cannot rank it less than an S. Okay. But I did get my quibbles about it. So there you go.
Okay, fair enough. Early death metal as well, so we're still on the coattails of thrash, I suppose. So, the next album. Do you know what, mate? It's Merciless. I'm going to... Jason, do you want to give your thoughts on this one before I chime in?
I mean, sure. I wrote some notes about it. Let me bring up my notes. Where is that Merciless? Oh, number 1. Basically a thrash metal album with aggressive vocals, very proto B tier. That's what I wrote when I was sober. But it is one of the first death thrash hybrids from Sweden, which is respectable. It was also on Euronymous' label, Death Like Silence. There's like a Slayer element mixed in with very early Swedish death metal riffing. There's a feral aspect to it. I don't give it a B personally, but your views may change. Merciless, I was very unimpressed by, but I was listening to Deicide too, so Deicide I got super into. But the Merciless, I liked a lot of aspects of it, but it wasn't as iconic as the Deicide, for me at least.
Yeah, that's why I deferred to you, because we kicked off this podcast, the Hate Meditations podcast, I should say, by discussing Swedish death metal, and this one had to come up because it's a Swedish band, one of the first death metal albums, so we obviously had to discuss Merciless, and obviously there is the Euronymous connection there as well, so we discussed that at length. And I re-listened to this again in preparation for this, and I love it as every bit as much as I did when I first listened to it, but I sometimes wonder if this album gets a lot of accolades because it is the first release, or first album at least, on Euronymous' label, and it is innovative. I guess in a similar way to the Massacra that I just rated S, but in a lot of ways, it is very innovative. It is very kind of there are some melodic. There's some melodic flair to it that kind of really does stand out, but at the same time, it is sort of very in keeping with the death thrash style of the late 80s and early 90s, especially in Sweden. In that, not sure how much it stands out versus, say, for instance, the Left-Hand Path that we've just discussed. But at the same time, I can't deny the kind of, in the same way that you were talking about the Massacre, the final Holocaust and the spirit behind it, I can't deny the spirit behind this album, and just say that it is almost sort of intoxicating in a way. And I'm inclined to give it an A, but yeah, that's why I call on you first, because I wanted to just get that clarity. But Joseph, maybe you could elaborate.
No, I think you're right in that it's maybe, except for a couple of these, it's definitely one of the most thrash rooted. Like it feels very, I don't think they ever had the opportunity, but if they could have toured with something like Morbid Saint or Dark Angel, some of the more extreme thrash bands of the later 80s, it would fit well into that. It does. It's interesting that Euronymous put them on their label because it does. It's weird how to explain it, but like it does sort of feel almost sort of elements of black metal. But I almost wonder if that is just more from the association than anything else. I enjoy it quite a bit. I feel like I'm kind of at a weird place now with our rankings in that pretty much this and every other album I like more than Massacra. So I feel like I'm just going to call it everything S because I would rather listen to this and the next 5 albums more than the Massacra album.
Do you know what? I can't have it next to the Cadaver, so I'm going to put it in A.
Yeah. It's a weird thing where like everything here I kind of like more than the Massacra and probably more than the Cadaver album. So it's like everything's gonna be S or A for me. Yeah, on its own, I think an A or a B I'd be fine with if I were just evaluating it. It's not this sort of like I definitely wouldn't put it alongside the first Deicide or Carnage. It's great. I would say with Massacra, like I feel like Massacra takes. You guys didn't mention it, but I think especially in European death metal, I think the German thrash scene, even in European black metal, I think the German thrash scene doesn't get quite as much mentioned as how much of an influence it was in Creator.
Yeah.
Seems to be a huge influence on a lot of these guys.
Early Destruction, Creator, definitely.
Yeah. And of course Sodom probably the more with the black metal. But like Massacra, I feel like are definitely taking Pleasure to Kill and sort of going like, okay, how can we make this even faster? Whereas I think like Merciless are very much tapping into something like Endless Pain, and I am, when it comes to Creator, as much as I love Pleasure to Kill, I am more an Endless Pain kind of guy. So Merciless definitely scratches that itch for that.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like we have created a bit of a gauntlet here by putting that Cadaver album at B, and now everything has to be lower or higher. I think you are right there, but let's see how this one plays out, because next up it is Napalm Death's Harmony Corruption. Now this is, I don't know, for me in my mind it's always a controversial album in that Napalm Death, they've obviously changed lineups 15,000 times before this album came out. This was the last album where Mick Harris was on drums, Shane Embry being the only kind of lasting member, not member in that sense, Jason, put your pants back on. And this is when they became a...
I mean, penis.
Dicks.
Dicks, cocks, members.
So anyway...
Phallus.
They'd gone over to Morris Sound. They'd got the Scott Burns guy in. They were trying to make longer songs. They were moving away from grindcore. All of this stuff. Barney Greenway was now in the picture from Benediction fame and so on. But I feel like they just created a thoroughly boring album. Like, it's not terrible. It's not the worst thing in the world. I've seen Napalm Death more times than you've had hot dinners. I've seen them play Suffer the Children. I've seen them play songs of this album. I've listened to this album many, many times. I think I prefer Utopia Banished because, not just because it has the Colin Richardson treatment, which is slightly more industrial, kind of colder sound that I think suited them a lot more. It's much more of a UK sound, but also the fact that they were a kind of like a new lineup getting to know each other, and then they were shipped out to Florida, which is across the Atlantic, and then just told to work with this producer that was renowned at the time, and it didn't work for them. And I remember reading in the Decibel book about Scott Burns that Scott Burns really did run up against Mick Harris, and they did not get on because his drum takes were out of time because he was a punk drummer. He's a very proficient, like adept drummer, but Scott Burns was used to precision drumming. And Mick Harris was always like, I don't work like that, and also give me the left-hand path sound. And Scott Burns is like, no, those are samples. They're not. The drum sound on left-hand path is a triggered sample. You can't, and he doesn't work like that, and that's what made him a special death metal producer, as contrasted to the Swedish sound that was going on in Sunlight and so on. So there was this kind of bitterness, this kind of thing that ultimately made Mick Harris leave the band and form Scorn ultimately, and he was, sort of checked out from Napalm Death at that point anyway. But also it kind of led to this sort of flat, I guess what you'd call it is a transitional album. It's the archetypical transitional album in a lot of ways, and there's much to love about it looking back as more of a death metal connoisseur, but at the visceral level, it's very monotone. It's very kind of flat and stale for me, and I prefer the albums either side, Enslavement to Obliteration and Utopia Banished. I think they're far superior. So I'm going to give it a B. I'm going to once again try and place an album next to Cadaver. Jason, what are your thoughts?
That's a good question, Shelley. You said B, and that's what I wrote on my notes, but the thing about Napalm Death going death metal, I don't think they actually shed the hardcore influence and the punk influence, but they structured their songs more in a death metal way with this album, but it's still like the spirit is not death metal. Yes, it has a texture of death metal, and I would honestly say that the greater synthesis of these, two genres, the grindcore and the death metal, would actually be in Fear, Emptiness, Despair, where they seem to realize, like, hey, we can have the punchy, riff-oriented aspects of death metal, but still do it in a framework that is completely fucking grindcore and hardcore and all that. I would agree that it's more of like a C or a B, but for this Napalm Death, yeah, it's not one that I ever want to go to. I do like Napalm Death. I know, like, a lot of people really like this band, but this album is not one I listen to very often.
Fair. Joseph?
Yeah, this one's a really interesting one. You guys kind of hit on a lot of notes already, and it's interesting we hadn't talked about Scott Burns till now, and I guess we've got a few here that were recorded, Morris. Let me guess, Deicide, Atheist, and Death, at least?
Yep.
Okay. And the other thing, when we talked about Death, that didn't get mentioned, that I know that it's spiritual healing. I think in particular, I don't think it was leprosy, I think it was spiritual healing, that Fenrez apparently threw a fit and made him convinced that black metal was the way because he hates the drum sound.
Yes.
On spiritual healing. Like, to him, it's just sort of like chalk, scratching like a chalkboard. He truly cannot stand it. So interesting in that, and I actually did recently buy, I was at MDF, and I was an idiot that I did not pick up the book when I could have gotten Scott Burns himself to sign it. But I just picked up the book now of his, and I do need to dive into that, because it's interesting hearing the stories of him being in conflict with Harris. Yeah, it's more than any of the other bands in this. I think especially because for a lot of the death metal bands, some of these are their first albums, and Napalm Death, in a lot of ways, it was... Midlife Crisis doesn't count because it's still so goddamn early in the band's legacy, but this was a major, major change. And then even within another album with Harris being gone, because, right before this is, I guess, in some ways considered the classic lineup with Lee and Bill Steer, and both of them being gone. And I think especially it's notable Bill no longer being there, since after Broderick left, and eventually formed Godflesh. I think Bill Steer was really the main riff writer in Napalm Death. And honestly, when evaluating the band's sound, they were already heading in a death metal direction. Like, it's a little bit more obscure, but if anyone checks out the Mentally Murdered EP, it sort of gives you this alternative universe if Bill and Lee never left the band, even though they continue in a more death metal direction. And I actually love that EP. That might be one of my favorite Napalm Death releases. So with that in mind, I do enjoy Harmony Corruption. There's a lot of great standout tracks like Suffer the Children, and a few others. I do think it's a solid album. It's a really good album. A sleeper favorite of mine actually is a bit of a later one. Jason, I was a little surprised he actually mentioned it. But yeah, I really enjoy... You mentioned... Utopia Banished, but Fear, Emptiness, Despair might be my favorite of the 90s Napalm Death albums. That said, I think Harmony Corruption is very solid. It's a mistake to ignore it, even if you're not into grind whatsoever. I would probably put it A. I'd be okay with B, but maybe for the life of Satan, could you please just move the image before the Cadaver one for my OCD to not be triggered?
Well, hang on. What did Jason say? I think he's gone for a piss. But
I think he said B.
Okay.
So
yeah, fine. Yeah.
So I would say A, but if that averages to B, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I'm not a shill for the book, but absolutely would recommend it just because it has so many anecdotes in there, just studio anecdotes, whether it's the musicians or Scott Burns himself, just saying like. Just the stories behind these albums where it's like so and so fucked up on this and we had to keep doing it again, blah blah blah. And speaking of which, we're about to talk about Nocturnus and going on in. So Scott Burns was integral to introducing all of these bands into a professional studio environment, and he did so at Morris Sound at the behest of the Morris brothers, who were very happy for him to do so because he didn't lose them money, and if anything, he made them money. And Roadrunner being one of the major labels that was, or one of the big labels that was constantly sending bands down to him. But the Morris Brothers themselves also produced a lot of integral albums, one of them being Blessed Are the Sick, another one being Nocturnus the Key, which was recorded at Morris Sound, but Scott Burns was not working on that album. And this is important for a number of reasons. I don't think you really need me to tell you that, but as we were talking about earlier on with the Atheist, it's one of the very, very earliest quote-unquote progressive death metal albums, one of the first albums to feature a full-time keyboard player, although I think that's more of a novelty than it is anything else. But also it was recorded...
You're calling Lou Ponzer a novelty?
Yeah. Yeah, come at me, bro.
I will come at you with that because I heard some Lou Ponzer like after he left Nocturnus, and he was like yoga acoustic work with fucking birds tweeting in the background. Like, he's a complete poser. I hate him. But go ahead.
It's kind of like when I search for Antaius on any streaming service and I get sort of Byzantine meditations, and then I get recommended Cut Your Flesh and Worship Satan. Anyway, The Key. I've always been a bit cynical about this album because I've always viewed it as a novelty album, but I was again listening to it a couple of times in preparation for this episode, and I do actually appreciate the fact that the keyboards, it's debatable whether they add anything or take anything away. They're definitely fun, but the album itself is very, very commendable. And the thing that I love about it is, much like I was saying with the Atheist early on, is as the Nocturnus were living beyond their means in that they the guitarists are obviously very, very competent, but they were met with a drummer, Mike Browning, who had a vision, God bless him, but he wasn't necessarily technically kind of able to live up to that. But that's kind of what I love about early extreme metal in general. You take your Corfons, your Tom G Warriors, hell, even, you know, if you want to go that far, take Lars Ulrich, for example. They have...
Mike Browning, I've chatted with him because obviously I was in a band with him, and his main influence on vocals was Corthon. Like, he was really influenced by Bathory when he did
that makes sense, because Corfon is sort of the kind of pinnacle of what I'm trying to get across here, is kind of musicians that have a vision and they live beyond their means, but they're still able to realize that vision. And Quorthon, we all know that once he moved beyond distorted vocals, my God, were his takes dodgy. But well, not you, Jason, but everyone loves fucking Hammerheart. Everyone loves kind of this thing that you can sort of see the vision that he was trying to convey in a similar way to, I think, what the Key was trying to do, in that it's a vicious album. Like, it still exists within the legacy of, say, Rain in Blood, for example, and it has that visceral primal element to it, but beyond that it does still convey a kind of a world beyond that. It's very, very expansive, and it's very, very enthralling and enveloping in a lot of ways. And that's, even before I come to the keyboard element, I think the construction of the songs, it's clumsy, it's clunky, not just because of Mike Browning, but just it's because it's young people sort of conveying a vision. It's very, very kind of all over the place in a lot of ways. A little bit like Altars of Madness is, but it gets across what it needs to. And yeah, regardless of the fact that it's dated, it really does kind of convey a vision, which, a lot of albums these days I don't think necessarily achieve. I will hand over. Jason, what are your thoughts?
You're doing a very good job being a host. Okay, Shelley, I want to commend you on that.
This is a compliment sandwich where you're about to just insult me.
No, I'm saying you're doing very well as the host today. And I concur with a lot of the sentiments that you said. However, there's some fucking bangers on the Nocturnus. It's not S tier, but it is A tier. And I know Mike Davis, which was the main guitarist in Nocturnus. He played with Trey Azagoth from Morbid Angel. They were good friends. And before Trey lost his mind, like, Trey is completely fucking cooked now. To use one of those Gen Z terms, he's cooked. But the Nocturnus, very ambitious work with the Key, and definitely the best album from Nocturnus. But yeah, I do have quibbles with the keyboards. Obviously, I play classical piano myself and all of that, but the execution, it's borderline acceptable, but there's some fucking moments in the album that are fucking great, and I love it so much from the sheer feral aspect of it. Like you said too, it's like they didn't, like Quorthon, he didn't completely know what to do with Nordic metal, if we should call it that. But the Key is like, okay, here's our first venture into sci-fi thrash death metal, and there's some fucking bangers on the Key. And not saying that, I've been in the rehearsal room with Nocturnus AD on a few occasions, which I have, and they play the song BC80. I fucking love it, and there's great fucking atmosphere and all that they create, and just that raw energy. I love it so much. I love the unrefined aspects of the Key. But is it a timeless classic? That's S tier for me, and I would say no, but it is a great fucking expression. And the issue that I've always kind of had with Browning, being I played with him when I was 20 in After Death, and he wanted to recruit me for Nocturnus AD at one point, but he tends to, he's not like an administrator like David Vincent is, or a facilitator or anything like that. He goes with the vibe of the jam room, and with that, a lot of people will throw in their own ideas, and that's where I think it becomes a little bit confused, is when you're in the jam room and you have like a keyboardist like Lou Panzer or Mike Davis, contrasting ideas with each other. I think it should be one person writing the songs, which Mike Davis was certainly capable of from Nocturnus, and Lou Panzer more of being an accompaniment to it, the background texture to it. I think that would have been a better execution. And, this is something I've always kind of reminisced on because I did play with After Death before I played in, I joined the military and joined the Air Force. And, I want to talk about Iran or Iran, or however you say that in England, and, Tel Aviv. It's more like... I know the munitions that they're using.
Yeah, so I tend to agree with an A ranking for the key. Joseph, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, what I'm saying is they're using...
You started talking about Iran. I was interested in your point until you moved on to foreign policy.
It's Iran. What I'm saying is it's really good that the U.S. Air Force has new munitions.
So, Joseph, what are your thoughts on the key? You're getting muted, Jason. Jesus Christ.
No, Shelley. Can I say one more thing?
No, Jason, no.
Let me say one more thing, Shelley. It's really good that the U.S. Air Force has updated their arsenal of munitions because the GBU-57, the GBU-57, I mean, people are going to click this shit now because I said it so many times, but the GBU-57...
Yeah, so getting edited out, mate.
You know what GBU stands for? Guided Bomb Unit.
Jason.
What I'm saying is the GBU...
Can I ask Joseph about what he thinks about the key, please?
It's a really good development for the U.S. Air Force because they
I'm not on a podcast about the U.S. Air Force. I want to talk about the key. Can I let Joseph talk about the key, please, Jason?
Fine.
Jesus Christ.
What I just want to say is a really good
development. Jason! I don't care. Joseph!
The GBU-57.
Jason! Shut the fuck up!
The GBU-57.
Fucking hell!
127. The blue 127. You have no idea. Like, this is a really good development that we're updating our arsenal.
That's great! Shut the fuck up!
I don't know. This is becoming very entertaining.
Fuck hell.
So anyway, about Iran. So that was okay. The key. So. I think it's, to be brief, I think it's a good album. It's not the greatest. It's not the S tier of Florida death metal. I don't think it's the S tier of 1990. It's good. It's really good. It's unique. Again, as we talked about with the keyboards, it's no one else was doing that in death metal at the time. The one thing I'll say about it as the album goes on, like I did a full playthrough of it not too long ago, and I do feel like after the halfway point towards the tail end, you do feel a little tired from it. I could probably say that about some other albums, but certainly with this one, I kind of feel it. But certainly when the album starts out, its novelty and the creativity really does hit you. It just, I think sometimes repeats a few things too often. It's good. I'd probably put it at B tier, just in terms of it's above average. Like it's good, but I don't know if I'd put it really certainly alongside Merciless, but I don't know if I'd put it alongside the other three in the A tier. If it ends up A tier because of summation of everyone, sure, fine. But for myself, I'd put it at B.
Okay. I hesitate to remind myself, but I think Jason put it at A. I don't want to ask him again in case he starts talking to me about Warheads, but we'll keep it at A for now. The next album we've got...
The Blue 127 was the warhead used on the GBU 57.
From this day forward is the next album we've got, and it is an album by a Canadian death/thrash band called Obliveon. And this is one of the wildcard choices, slightly more obscure, but I have been listening to this album for many, many years and absolutely fucking love it. I feel like it kind of does what we were describing earlier on with Nocturnus, and to some extent Atheist as well, in that it manages to perfectly integrate progressive influences with what is a unambiguously death metal album, maybe with some thrash sort of still lurking in the DNA there. And I was actually surprised to, I was actually surprised to, in sort of again compiling the list for this album, because I've known this album for many years. I was surprised to sort of remind myself that it was released in 1990. I thought it was quite a bit later than that, and they had an album in '93 called Nemesis, which has its moments, but it's not quite as good. But yeah, I thought this was a much later album, and I realized in the chronology of, if we're talking about progressive extreme metal, this is an untapped gem. And in a recent video essay of mine, I did actually sort of contrast even the fucking album cover of this album with the recent Blood Incantation album. But I would challenge any fan of death metal that's just got into death metal via the newest Blood Incantation album, go back and listen to something like this as well, and just tell me what you think, because I think you might be surprised as to how much of that DNA was kind of baked within death metal from the get-go, as I was trying to allude to earlier on with the Atheist as well, because there's the sci-fi element here. There's this sort of jazzy, sort of this free jazz fusion element going on. There is still a very sort of playful, almost what we would today understand as pizza thrash element, but back then it was just, what extreme metal was. And there is, it combines this into what is still quite a sort of dark, malevolent, overbearing atmosphere, despite the fact that the album cover it does just look like an 8-bit kind of video game cover or whatever. It looks like what you get on the back of a box of cereal, but it's a really good kind of I can't think of anything any more articulate than that. It's just very, very quality undiscovered gem, I think I would say. Who should I call on first? I guess I'll call on Jason. I'll just mute you if you get annoying.
Okay. I know we've both been drinking, Shelley, so I'll give you that grace.
Well, no, if you could just talk about the music at hand rather than start talking about missiles, that'd be great.
Right. This is a thrash metal album parading around as death metal. Yes, it does have its charm. It's very well put together. But still, it's 100% thrash metal. That's the DNA of it. The Obliveon from this day forward. I would rank it honestly as a B. Honestly, because I know we were taking consideration like the holistic aspect of time. Like, look at the history of philosophy. And in philosophy, we're more about the ideas than when they came from. But it's still a thrash metal album, and I thought a lot of thrash bands do it better than Obliveon. But that's my 2 cents. Joseph, go.
Probably even more so than Cadaver and Impetigo. I knew some of their other albums or knew their reputation. This one was a total out of left field. I don't think I've ever heard of this band before. So it's very hard for me to judge it, given that it was a very, very, very fresh listen. I really enjoyed what I heard, though. It immediately made me think of Coroner, who are one of my favorites, thrash bands on the more technical or progressive side of things. When it comes to that, probably like Voivod and Coroner at the top. In some ways, it sort of just feels like a more death metal leaning kind of Coroner, but that's not a bad formula for me. To potentially praise this higher as you have, Shelley, I think I would definitely need more time with it. I think, and I also, because of that, can't put it above Harmony Corruption. So I would give it B with a lot of potential to grow.
Fair enough. I would also say on the sort of spectrum of Coroner, Voivod, whatever, I think we discussed them on a previous episode. Dead Brain Cells, I would also highly recommend both their self-titled debut and Universe. on a similar spectrum to this. It's sort of that coroner watchtower type thing. Not Jason's tackle, obviously, but yeah, I don't think you could. It would be unfair to say these guys are a thrash band, but on this album in particular, they're doing quite a lot that kind of veers off into lots of different directions. And I think, especially for the fact that this was 1990, putting it alongside something like Piece of Time, I think it's a very, very, very unique work that does warrant bit of scrutiny by anyone that claims to be a fan of old school death metal. Anyway, speaking of old school death metal, we've got a band called Obituary with an album called Cause of Death. Now, I have shat on this band and this album many, many times on the podcast. I'm going to rescind all of that, re-listen to it. It is a fantastic piece of death metal. Who could deny that? And I think Slowly We Rot is as well. I've just been sort of in the mood to be quite belligerent because they are that basic, that sometimes derivative, and sometimes I do sort of get frustrated that Obituary sometimes overshadow more interesting bands as the aforementioned Obliveon and Atheist, and so on. But Cause of Death, who could deny that this is a absolutely outstanding piece of kind of primitive fun also, but also haunting and slightly gothic death metal in the way that we were talking about earlier on. It is just so well constructed. I've listened to this album again. Most of these albums, I've been listening to it for many, many years, but the tracks on here are very, very long, but they never get boring. They never get repetitive. They're very, very logical in the way that they're constructed. They're very basic, but very intuitive. Every single piece of this album is sort of exactly where it needs to be, in a similar way to something like to Megatherion or any sort of Burzum album, or to, you know, for that matter, anything by kind of Deicide or whatever. It's just everything sort of follows exactly where it needs to be, but it's just, and also I like the fact that it is quite sluggish. It's quite calculated in the way that it works. It doesn't sort of blitz past you in the way that a Suffocation or a Gorguts album does, which was never what Obituary were about. They were always about just doing things very deliberately and very sort of primally and basically, but my god, did they do it right on this album, and my god, were they fucking boring after this album. Slowly We Rot and Cause of Death, they got it right, but yeah, the album after this, and then just sort of fell off a cliff. But yeah, it's just a shame that kind of people, I guess, learnt the wrong messages from this. So yeah, I'm going to stick it up in S tier. Just going to whack it up there and then see how it fares up there. I'll go Joseph first, then I'll go Jason.
You hit a lot of the same points, I feel. I'm not particularly a fan of this band's later material. I'm forgetting even the name of it, but that third album isn't bad, but it certainly isn't a continuation of this level.
The End Complete?
Incomplete. And maybe the lack of James Murphy might have something to do with that. At the same time, Slowly We Rot sometimes is my preferred Obituary album. It kind of goes back and forth. But this is a solid album. This is, I think, arguably, there's a solid argument to say this is Obituary's best album. I mean, I think that's well established in our scene, given the fact that I just saw them at Maryland Death Fest play a very celebrated headliner slot, playing the entire album. Not front to back. It was a little mixed up here. And weirdly, given that Triptychon was playing a Celtic Frost set, they actually started this with the Circle of the Tyrants cover, which was an interesting move. But it's weird thinking of that too, because I do think Obituary, especially the first two albums, embodies sort of taking the Celtic Frost sound, especially the first two albums, and probably to Megatherion most of all, and moving it from sort of Tom G. Warrior's headspace of sort of weird fiction in the mountains of Switzerland and, you know, all their odd little influences, and putting it into the swamps of Florida. You know, you describe that, and I think you get a sense of early Obituary very much. I enjoy it, but yeah, it's odd that they kind of took the geeky weird kidness of Celtic Frost and turned that sound into something that could be enjoyed at the gym. That's kind of the way I think of Obituary. And given a lot of Obituary fans, like, let's just say, they made Celtic Frost into something J-Dog can enjoy. I think that's sort of the best way to think about it. Which isn't to say it's bad. It's not. It's not at all. It's actually really good, I think, and that kind of gym quality shows up even more later, I think. Like if the band ended here, wouldn't necessarily have that association. It's good, and we need to stop blathering on. I don't think I would put it in S tier, especially because it's blasphemy to put it ahead of Left Hand Path. So I would say A, but even dig into it to give it a B, so it ends up in A. But
Ooh,
yeah,
okay.
I think it should be an A.
Before I move it, then, Jason.
What do you want me to say, Shelley?
I want you to say what is in your heart, Jason.
Well, what is in my heart is very complex.
Do you like Cause of Death by Obituary?
The thing about this album is that I loved it back when I was 12, 13, 14. The atmosphere that it creates is fucking indomitable. Beautiful atmosphere. Dark fucking atmosphere. And, I was in art class back in the 8th grade, Shelley. In the 8th grade. Not the 7th grade or 9th grade, the 8th grade.
I'm English. I have no idea what grades mean. I just hear them. I'm just like, yep, that's an age. What's 8th grade?
Back when I was like 13, 14.
Right, okay.
Watching the Obituary in my ears, doing sculptures and molds of faces, and Cause of Death. I was listening to that on my little Walkman thingy, and I put I put nails instead of teeth in the sculpture's head, and I just made it like the most grotesque thing anything would ever see. Which, by the way, I'm better at sculpting than I am at actually like painting or anything like that. My mom and the rest of my family, phenomenal painters, oil painters, fine detail and all that. But when it comes to me, I'm more into like molds and sculpting and all that. But Obituary, Cause of Death, that atmosphere, that dark fucking atmosphere that they were able to conjure up, that put me into like a warped state of mind where as a little 13, 14-year-old, I made these molds, like these horrific molds with fucking teeth or fucking nails instead of teeth. And I went on Christmas break, and I came back to school after Christmas break, and the teacher had put all my molds into the oven because they were so fucking scary. But yeah, fucking great atmosphere. S tier compared to Morbid Angel, no. I would rank it as a strong fucking A, just because it is more atmosphere oriented than it is riff oriented. But the riffs do connect, and like the comparisons to Celtic Frost are very apt. But I feel that Celtic Frost did it better. Especially now that I'm older. I listened to early Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, and I'm like, wow, this is fucking amazing for the time that it came out. But Cause of Death is one of those albums that, and granted too, because I don't know if I'm autistic or not, but when I first heard it,
definitely autistic. Yeah.
When I first heard it, I felt these layers coming down upon me. The guitar riffs created like these metaphysical layers that encroached upon my soul, and I loved it so much. But yeah, Morbid Angel's better.
fair. That's fair. I'm no highfalutin psychiatrist or whatever, but I don't know if you've got autism, but you've definitely got something. Thank you for that. That was actually really profound, and you've also qualified where it should be, which I think is where it probably should be. Fluke in Obituary's career, but a very, very, very foundational album for any death metal fan. Joseph, I don't want to put you on the spot, but why don't you introduce this last album, which is Paradise Lost, first album, Lost to Paradise?
Yeah, Shelley and I were talking about this a bit beforehand. Doom Death is one of my all-time favorite genres, and Paradise Lost debut album is probably certainly the one that leans most towards the death metal side. They very rapidly, by the third album was the last vestiges of death metal growls until almost maybe 20 years later. I had to double check the calendar on that, but this one started it all. My Dying Bride, Anathema, all of the, even like the funeral Doom Death, so Skepticism and everything else, all of it really kind of comes from this. There's a few other things you can point to, Winter, and a few other things, but this also was a big start for Peaceville. And I think this is the only album. I'm not sure if Gothic maybe, but certainly this was one of the few albums that Paradise Lost actually was on Peaceville, because they always get associated as a Peaceful 3, but they were only on it for a brief period of time. Gothic definitely overshadows this, where they took the formula of this album, which, as Shelley noted, for him it sort of sounds like a more Gothic autopsy. And I think there's a lot to that. There's probably some other musical strands showing up in it, but I think it's very apt, especially given Autopsy also being attached to Peaceville. It's one of those albums that doesn't get praised as much, again, even within their discography, but I love it. I adore it. The whole slower death metal, the menace, the atmosphere, the vibe to it. It's something I think that very well accompanies something like Dark Throne Soulside Journey, again, early Autopsy, definitely sits well with early Tiamat, at least up to Clouds, early Amorphous. I think it fits very well with something like that. Just if you've always shied away from it, because when you think of Paradise Lost, you think of Draconian Times, or God forbid, you think about some of their more like Radiohead moments. Please ignore that. Please check this album out. In a historical sense, given its importance, I would put it as a personal sense. For me, this is S tier, just also because I can't put this at the same level as certain other albums. I adore it a lot. I definitely put Gothic probably a bit higher, but a classic and really genre starter for Doom Death.
Okay. So you might see me preemptively put it on the A tier. Sorry, I can't, with good conscience, put it on the S tier. More of a personal thing, but yeah, you basically, you articulated what I was going to say about it. In terms of as Paradise Lost, sort of as them as a death metal band go, you always sort of reach for Gothic as the one, in that is like it's the most unique kind of melding of goth and death metal that there is. I think they surpass even sort of My Dying Bride in terms of what they managed to do with that album, especially given that all of those Peaceful bands existed in the wake of Celtic Frost, especially to Megatherion, to Into Pandemonium, kind of Celtic Frost. I think, Therion, they gave it a damn good shot, but Paradise Lost were the ones that really sort of carried the baton of what that album was. But because that album is so kind of pinnacle and so unique in that way, the debut does tend to get overlooked. And yeah, I stand by what I said in terms of it's like in a similar way to a lot of these bands, they're still finding their voice. Atheist hadn't really learned that they were a progressive death metal band. They were just a death metal band that was far more technical than the other things that were going on. Deicide hadn't really kind of figured out who they were yet. They were still just a very, very violent iteration of death metal. So, you could say ditto Carnage, to some extent Napalm Death, even though they were an older band or whatever. Paradise Lost were in a very similar boat in that they weren't intending to become a sort of pillar of gothic rock. They were just part of a very, very germinal English death metal scene that was very, very tied to, at the time, hardcore punk and industrial, but you had these northern bands that were much more tied to the goth scene, and they didn't really know how to reconcile that with their passion for death metal, which at the time kind of just meant pretty much Slayer. And yeah, they came up with this album that is overlooked a lot of the time for the sake of the fact of their superior subsequent albums. But yeah, I do concur with Joseph. I wouldn't necessarily rate it an S or an A, but I've sort of put it as an A to be diplomatic. But Jason, do you have any thoughts on it?
I never liked this band ever, but I will commend them. They do have some good harmonies here and there that, from just musician standpoint, sound really well. And, just the inner workings of the music is very solid. But the music itself doesn't do anything for me. I wrote in my notes, it's a B tier. Something about like extreme metal and like depressive atmospheres, it's like they conflict each other. Like I view that extreme metal is not depressive at all. It could have some dark elements, that you project your own depression on, but when music becomes depressive, it's more like an isolated thing, in my opinion. But I'm super drunk right now, so I want to wrap up, Shelley.
I mean, it's an interesting idea because there's certainly a lot of throughout metal songs about suicide. Like that is not an uncommon, and long before suicidal black metal. So that's an interesting subject maybe to dive into.
It is, and I've actually written about it recently. But Judas Priest had many lyrics about suicide, and they were taken to court over it. And as you say, Joseph, I think it's one thing that warrants unpacking in the same way that earlier on we were talking about progressive death metal in the musical sense. It is worth unpacking depressive or depressive elements in metal, full stop, and what they are, what they should mean, where they come from.
I just feel it's antithetical to like true metal expression to be super depressive. So
I and part of me concurs with that, but I think it's interesting. It could be interesting to unpack that, but yeah. So I think no one's landed up on the D tier. I think we've pretty much done our list now, and there might be some controversial picks, but I think we've pretty much ended up with a fairly diplomatic gradient here. Any last thoughts on this? We've been going for 2.5 hours now. I've got piss bleeding out of my eyes, so if we could be quick about it. But been very much a pleasure talking to you.
Enjoyed this. One thing I'll say is I'm sure someone will chime in that Y isn't eaten back to life somewhere on here.
That's because we've covered Cannibal Corpse on 3 previous episodes, and if you want to know our opinion on Cannibal Corpse, you can listen to those episodes.
Joe,
Fair.
No,
yep.
It's a big no.
No? Okay.
Well, that is one of the reasons, because we have the troll under the bridge that will just say, "Yeah, Cannibal Corpse, no, slap it down, go away." And then we'll have me, it's like, well, at the time it was a big deal, but also it's a bit shit, isn't it? If you